Good to be here. We actually have some people who teach in the program are here and who are a part of the creation of it, so we can always add in. I don't have we'll still probably, Roy, 20 minutes? Okay, so we'll shoot to be done at 1:45. So I only have about 10 minutes, and so I'm hoping it can be a fairly open conversation around possibilities. You know, it's interesting, if we were to do this all again, generative AI was not really a viable option at the time. So we are thinking about that now, but that's, we're not going to redesign the program since it's going well. But it's interesting if we would be launching the program today, how it might be different given the conversations that we've had today. So in any case, all right. So and maybe one thing I want to make sure we get to is this is a research-driven enterprise, and so whether I focus on all those details, but that might be the interesting thing is how does my own researchers, how does Marshall's research, how does Chris's research relate to what we chose to build and how we built it? I think that's something I want to make sure we get to. But in some ways, this is the provocative question I'd like to frame. So the question is high quality graduate education artificially scarce? And if so, why? So in some ways, as universities, we have to become more problem focused. We can't play the if we build it, they will come. If we teach it, they will come. We have to say what kind of problem are we solving? And so the typical thing is we put it online, so we make it more accessible. That's the first thing we do. The next thing we might do is then we might lower the cost. You can pick the number, 50%, 80%. But this is the one I want to really poke the bear at. And this is where I maybe want to spend the time is what did we do, but more importantly as IT, organizational researchers, strategy researchers, where do we really need to be operating at to really change the game with education? So again, but this is the hardest thing to do. And I will put rather directly, and I'll say the following phrase. So I'm an open innovation scholar. So I'm an open innovation guy. That's what I do. And so one thing we know about open innovation is you have to decenter the role of who? The existing expert. Who's the existing expert when it comes to education? It's us. And so that's the interesting question is how do we both reflect on decentering ourselves while we do that, making that decentering all the more powerful. So if you really think about it, this is kind of what I would like to present. We'll get there in terms of what we went about, but that's really the provocative question I want to get at. Okay, so I'll just let you know what we did. So first of all, we created an integrated MBA. Remember, since the Ford Foundation critiqued business schools in the 1950s and 60s, what did they say? It was basically a backwater place, and so it became more the academy. And so we lived with that the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then we've been talking about, well, it's a professional school. Why don't we teach it like medicine where we do clinicals, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, this became the first, for us, we said, let's use this as a green space and get back to where we were, but in a more enhanced way. So that's what we did. The second one, we reduced the cost by 80%. Why not, right? There should be some nervous laughter when I say that. Okay, so that's the price. And then the third one then, and this is maybe we can toy with what the right metaphor of what we built or what we should be building or what collectively we would give advice for people to build. So this question is, how do we make the classroom of 400 human beings? How do we turn that to a learning community, a learning network at scale? So that became the kind of the goal that we set apart to do. So again, that's maybe where the decentering of our role, but more importantly, again, how our research would inform that decentering process. Okay, so we launched in 2020. We currently have 1,800 active students. As of next week, we will have graduated 1,000 students. So that's maybe where I think Avi's proposed the title 0 to 800, and that was actually 800 students in 6 months. That's where that came from. Okay, so maybe I just want to start with this picture. I'm going to play with this for a little while. So as an open innovation scholar, I have to say to myself, I got to go to where the problem exists, not inside the laboratory. Where does the problem exist in the world? So at Questrom, we started some processes in 2014 with our 100-year anniversary, where we did at the time using IBM's JAM technology, kind of a crowdsourcing technique, to kind of identify what are the business problems for the next decade. But it was academics, it was publishers, it was executives. So we tried to, again, pull in a lot of people to kind of define what that was. So this became going to the manager leader and not the academic leader to define what those business problems are. So that became a critical first step. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. The next thing we wanted, so that became for me sacrosanct. And maybe even from a design thinking point of view, you might begin with the end in mind. If we're not solving a business problem, then I don't want you in my house. I don't want to, but that's a tough thing. So the next thing we wanted to do is, given the price point, in some ways the price point forced what? Scale on us. And so the question is, how do I make scale not just a volume problem, 400 human beings I got to deal with, or 400 human beings that can actually be smarter than me, enhance me, extend me, be more real time than any faculty member could ever be. Now we start thinking about AI, but these are human. This is kind of a human analytic, right? How do we use the human analytic to do that? So that became a really important thing for us to do. And I'll have a slide that will kind of pick this apart. Then the last one, because integrated curriculum. We've probably said that 10 times already this morning, right? So the question is, but I want you to start to think about, if I'm going through digital transformation of any company, but they were siloed, unbundled services, people didn't talk. But once we have direct line of sight between what we're creating in the end use case, is we have to bundle the services. So when I say integrated curriculum, it's not just I'm integrating finance and accounting, I'm integrating student services, I'm integrating a lot of things. And so you're almost disciplining the whole organizational structure to be very different. And maybe what I might add to is you're doing that inside of an existing firm, in this case BU, that is orthogonal to all three of those things on average, right? The way we currently deliver the product is very different. So that's in some ways, this is even a conversation on how do you do a startup inside of a large organization. Yep.
Can I, quick question, and maybe you'll get to this. In your reimagining, were you also thinking about who needs an MBA, or was it that the price point will be attractive enough to bring more people into the market?
I think, if edX was in the room, that would be. I helped with OpenCourseWare when I was a junior professor at MIT in 1996, right? So we started it then, and that was free. And so there's a mantra around free or cheap. And so ultimately the price point became, as edX has kind of moved from free to up, now there's been acquisitions and Coursera and the whole 9 yards, and the universities are moving down to that price point. I think, unfortunately, that's where the calculation gets as cheap is cheap. Versus for me, cheap is how do I now, Sun Microsystems, Bill Joy, remember what's his famous statement? The smartest people in the world don't work for me. So what I saw in the cheap price point was to say, those 400 people don't work for me. They would never come to Boston because they are living in a job they love, with a PTA they love, with a soccer team they love, with a spouse they love. Why would I ever want to bring them here? So in some ways, you almost think about, they actually are bringing me more value than a student who would be willing to uproot themselves and come here. So it tells you that there's value where they live. So in some ways, if I go to the open source metaphor of the smartest people in the world don't work here, how do I leverage them as a scaled network of learning? Not, I got to sell 400 pancakes to people and I got to grade them and I got to leave them happy. So that was more, because I think in some ways the migration from 0 to 24 is, cheap is about access, but for me it was about how does it force me to reimagine? And so this was kind of because you could, in some ways you could make the 24K wouldn't force you to reimagine. So that became, okay, so maybe a little bit about, so I'm going to create a stack model. For those of you who know me, I'm all about the stack models. So at one level, Chris is here and others are here. So my research is in the area of knowledge creation. So how do I create knowledge across disciplinary groups? I'm that guy, right? And so the question here is, if I don't have a common language, and if I don't have shared methods, I can't create a learning community. Now, the other thing about research around learning communities is, if I don't have a shared problem or a shareable problem, I have no learning community. That's sometimes what the research forgets, right? They look at one that's already existing and they forget all that stuff. So in some ways, you already have the shared problem. That's, again, sacrosanct design principle. So the question is, if I think about this layers I'm going to be creating, is what's the role of the faculty member? The role of the faculty member is to create a common language and shared methods so all these people can talk to each other. That's the job. So in some ways, it's kind of, in some ways, it's not redefining, it's clarifying what our job is. And so we do this, so that's the traditional teaching role. I'm the expert. But more importantly, that's my job as the expert. I mean, I was here for Andy. Think about what Andy tries to do, right, in the classroom. In some ways, that's what you're trying to do. What's the common language, and what are the shared methods to do that? And so that would be an asynchronous material, video, text content, how simulations, whatever you might do to do that. We also have a weekly architecture. So that would be happening the first 3 to 4 days of the week. I want everybody to be on the same page. I'm going to force them. There's tremendous pressures in the marketplace to do what? Self-paced. What is self-paced the recipe for? Individual learning. If I want 500 people to talk to each other, I can't pursue that, right? And so in some ways you want to, so you're forcing a learning architecture on that. We all have to learn the common language and the method in the first 3 to 4 days. And I'm going to do that largely through technologies we know, Blackboard, LMSs, et cetera. The second layer, this is when it starts to get interesting. And so the second layer is the faculty member becomes a facilitator. Now, again, I think particularly when we teach more advanced electives or executives, we're more comfortable with the facilitation role. How do I allow people to help each other in this? But largely, a focus here is the weekly architecture shifts to 1 day of the week, which we call the live week, where you bring everybody, the 400 people. We have an AM and a PM, so we might split them in half. And this is where I come to ensure we roughly know the common language and the common methods. And so there, we're not lecturing, we're doing application, we're doing cold calling, we're doing the things that we can do to try to assess, are we comfortable using that language? Again, so this is live in the Zoom, and let me then get to the last part, is in some ways, this is where we start to think to ourselves, again, we had a conversation, Marshall and I are really good friends, and we're thinking to ourselves, how do we get out of the way? So if we provide a common language and methods, that's my shared standard to generate what? Network effects. Let's use a fancy term for the day. We've used it a couple times, but we'll use it again. So the question is, how do I actually allow network effects to occur in the learning network? So basically you're saying, I'm going to remove me as the constraint on the network effect. And so if I provided the common language and the common methods, this should roughly work. And so there we do, in the big and the small, we do teaming throughout. So obviously there should be a small, dense network effect, right, within the team itself. But then there should be a larger network effect that we achieve through a technology called YellowDig. The purpose of YellowDig, it's basically like a Reddit. It's not about the post, it's about the comments that follow. Typically, if you look at really interesting posts, what typically happens when human beings get on something to talk about they think they're really smart about? They first of all talk about how they're all different. Retail is different in Taiwan than it is in China. Strategy is different than IT. So everybody talks about how they're different. But what happens after they start to talk a while? They realize that 80% of the world is the same no matter where you go. And my goal as an educator is exactly that, is if they can understand what's generalizable knowledge, and then the circumstantial knowledge, it's not that it's inconsequential, but then they know how to parlay it. And more importantly, I'm going to pick on Andy again, is if Andy has already tried, if his circumstances are different from mine, he's tried something already, maybe he's in pharmaceuticals and I'm in retail, and I'm listening to his supply chain story, and I'm thinking to myself, I can do that. And so then you get the additional benefit of the circumstantial knowledge also becomes a source of insight or innovation, or maybe you could use a fancy term, it reduces the novelty, because Andy's dealt with the novelty for 10 years, say in pharmaceuticals. In retail, we're just getting there, because we don't think about clothing as something that dies. That's something that has to be, I mean, you pick your expression to kind of think about where that might go. So in some ways, this is the stack model. This is what we're trying to do. So in some ways, you're decentering the faculty, not from the expert role, you're reclarifying it, you're redirecting the facilitation role, all to set up this larger thing. And of course, one of the challenges that we face is when people get grades, what do? They turn back into 18-year-old people. And not, and I probably should have said a little bit more in the beginning, our average age is 37. And that's our target market. We felt that the adult, if anybody studies adult education, it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy because what? The adult learners is where if we provide high quality graduate education, we can make a huge difference in these people's lives. But typically, how are adult learners approached? K through 12 methodologies and all those types of things. Adults want to come on average to learn from a community unless I'm just learning that particular skill. And there's other platforms, Udemy, et cetera, are very good at that. So, so these are the things we're proud of. We're proud of retention. We have 95% retention, which is interesting for a 500, 400 person classroom where you have lockstep curriculum. This is very unusual. So we could talk a little bit about what is the stickiness of that stack model? What is the stickiness of the learning community when there's a lot of pushes to say self-paced, individual, nobody wants to talk to each other. So in some ways, there's a lot of, as you can see, the teaming curriculum obviously plays. We have to manage that, right? We're managing 400 teams every semester. So I mean, there's back-end technology that we need to think through. There's a lot of other people involved. Again, the 1,000 graduates, and maybe to this bullet point here, I think the things that we're most proud of is, to me, this is an application of knowledge creation research. This is the application of learning communities research. This is the application of kind of platform thinking, network thinking. This is also the application, and Venkat's not here, Venkat's another person who's had a lot of influence on that, is if he thinks about bundling services for digitization, this is also a part of that. Because in some ways you could make the argument that higher ed is one of the last siloed indigenous sets of species, right? In fact, religions have become less siloed than us, right? Depending on which kind of religion you are. But on average, religions have become much more integrated in their approaches. So with that, we have 5 minutes, right? Right? Questions? Yeah. So this is interesting thing about scale. So we do not use any adjunct professors whatsoever. So we have, I mean, is anybody, Jeff, you want to raise your hand? So we have, basically, we have our best teachers. David's here. I mean, we have our best teachers in the school who teach the program. Why? Because I can scale Marshall. Now, if you go to the logic inside the organization, one thing you say, why would you put Marshall in a program where they only pay $24,000 in tuition? But if I can put 500 people in the classroom and they're adult learners and they have a lot of influence in their organization and they probably get Marshall quicker than maybe a 25-year-old might because they see the trends. So this is part of the logics, you know, because it's a whole set of logics we have to shift with these kind of things. So that's one. But then the question is, you know, Jeff teaches in it, but he can't do all the grading. So he has a team of 4 learning facilitators. Who do the grading. So he meets with them, they calibrate those kinds of things. So that's how we also surround the scale, because I can't have, you know, Marshall can't grade that many people. The average class size is between 400 and 500. Yeah. So now when you go back to the stack model, you got to believe that stack model, right? Otherwise, yeah, go ahead. So let me be strong here. You ready? So what's the problem with our business model, our physical business model? It's the alluvial fan of whatever anybody wants to teach, right? Electives, concentration, etc. This is why we are not a business. We just spew stuff out and people consume it, right? That's the challenge of what we have to focus on. What do you think this model is? I only have 6 classes. Now they're 8 credits apiece, and it's the only class you take in a given semester. I do not have electives. I do not have concentrations. That would destroy my business model, just like it's destroying our business models. Our business models of face-to-face education are very, very, very inefficient. So this is why this thing is one of the most profitable programs in this university. Now, what does it force me to do? Then I have to have a continuous improvement cycle. So it's not so much Jeff, you know, I got to force Jeff to change his class. You know, I'm the department chair, I come to Jeff, hey, Jeff, you know, you haven't changed your class in 10 years. We have a process where we have people coming to say, what's the data saying? What are the trends? Where might we need to have a continuous improvement process So if I can't continually improve it, then I can't prove to you as a student saying, is it cutting edge or not? So often what happens in traditional programs, because I put an AI class as an elective, then you think it's cutting edge, right? The problem about putting an AI class as an elective, it's an AI class that's not connected to my ops teaching, to my strategy. You know, I mean, you can think about how sometimes where these electives sit, whereas here we have to integrate it. So maybe a simple example, now I'm gonna pick on Jeff, is, so Jeff teaches a course called so there's a combination of, and sometimes I call it, there's big ass strategy, which Jeff is, there's big ass marketing and big ass operations, right? Those classes are never taught together. So when they frame that question, they are bringing the big conversations that need to take place and the trade-offs that would need to take place. So the goal there is that, so we have a combination of core and elective distributed throughout the whole thing, because the business problem doesn't say core or elective. The business problem says, help me, help me, help me. And then somehow we have to think about what that would look like. So that's the other thing too with our particular user is, if you're 37, you're likely coming from a concentration. I'm a lawyer, I'm in healthcare, I'm in analytics, and I've moved in the organization and I want to be at the central conversation. I want to be at that generalizable conversation. And so that increases our confidence that, again, we have to improve and stay cutting edge, but it's the collective conversation that you want them to be able to have. If they were 24, they probably wouldn't value that. Yeah.
I think we are going to stay on schedule.
Stay on schedule.